Hello, everybody. A couple of weeks ago, we did a show with the historian Richard Kreitner on American Jewish attitudes towards the Civil War. His book is Fear No Pharaoh, American Jews, the Civil War, and the Fight to End Slavery. There were some Jews in the 19th century, American Jews, who were sympathetic, oddly enough, to slavery, others who were radically opposed to it. But perhaps the guy who most symbolized the 19th century American Jewish experience was Isaac Mayer Wise, supposedly the foremost rabbi in America. And his attitude towards the Civil War, from a Jewish point of view, was to keep out of it, not to open one's mouth too radically and draw attention to oneself. Perhaps that reflected the lack of confidence of American Jews in the 19th century. Today, we're moving forward 100 years, and we're talking about 20th century eminent Jews with my guest, David Denby. Doesn't need much of an introduction. David is the legendary movie reviewer of The New Yorker, author of many interesting books. And this latest book focuses on four prominent or eminent 20th century American Jews: Leonard Bernstein, Mel Brooks, Betty Friedan, and Norman Mailer. David Denby is joining us appropriately from the Upper West Side in New York City. David, congratulations on the new book.
Oh, thank you so much. I am very happy to be on this show. So many interesting people have been on this show.
So, David, I don't want to turn this into a 19th versus 20th century American Jewish experience, but all the Jews you cover have a great deal of confidence. When we think, I'm not sure how much you know about Isaac Mayer Wise, but is there a profound difference, do you think, between the American Jewish experience in the 19th century and 20th century in terms of confidence and willingness, so to speak, to stand out?
Oh, well, absolutely. There was a lot of fear of anti-Semitism right through the 30s and 40s, even in the middle of the war. Hollywood moguls famously refused to put the word Jew into anything in any of their movies in the 40s, nor did they put anything about Germany. They were afraid of losing the German markets. It was until 1939 that finally turned around. And once the war started, half the movies, whatever the genre was, whether it was a war film or a romance, were anti-fascist. But anyway, the Jews came out of the war and fought against anti-Semitism, and there was horror about the Holocaust, which was not a word that was used until the late 60s, but certainly everyone knew about the slaughter of 6 million people. And a number of other things happened. It was obvious the Jews were doing well financially, not in big industry, not in oil or steel or railroads or airways, but in every kind of business and entertainment, of course, in intellectual professions, teaching of all kinds. Now, this is a curious thing. If you were Jewish, you weren't supposed to say this. In fact, scholars didn't begin talking about Jewish economic success until the late 90s. There was one, Simon Kuznets, Nobel winner, who pointed out the high levels of Jewish.
The famous curve, right?
Yeah.
Curve.
But by the 60s or so, it was obvious that things were going well. It was just shush. Didn't want to talk about it much, but my guys certainly benefited. Three of them went to very good colleges. Mel Brooks grew up on the streets, and then in the Catskill Mountains, which are a Jewish summer resort, now gone, but it was a remarkable thing where the whole East Coast sort of went to 100 miles northwest of New York, and there were hundreds of hotels, large and small, and Mel went there at 14, and that was his university, and he began entertaining, and within a few years, all of his comics, like Danny Kaye and many others, were appearing on the Ed Sullivan Show, which was for 23 years the kind of clearinghouse nationally on television every Sunday night for new talent, the Beatles, Elvis, and also all these Jewish comics. So there were a whole bunch of reasons that now there are a very powerful group of intellectuals in New York, the so-called New York intellectuals, who set literary standards. All this was going on at once. So my guys were born after the First World War. I chose them.
Right. Just to remind everyone, and I made a note of this, Bernstein is the oldest of you.
1918, yeah.
1918, Mel
And
Brooks,
Mel,
1926, Betty
exactly,
Friedan, 1921, and Norman Mailer, 1923.
exactly right. And uh, after the Second World War, they emerged by means of their own great gifts, but also by means of all the new media, which was bursting out. Both television and the long-playing record became mass media in 1948. And then a little later, paperback, mass market paperbacks, which
Yeah, you wrote an interesting piece in the Atlantic about how recently about how Leonard Bernstein changed the canon. David, everyone's going to be asking you this about how you chose these people. Everyone has their own list of eminent Jews. You're a man of lists. As a film reviewer, you often list your favorite movies. Some people will agree, some won't. How did you choose these four people?
Well, I didn't want the usual objects of Jewish veneration like jurists, like Felix Frankfurter or Brandeis, or great scientists like Jonas Salk. I wanted it to be people who, as I started to say, in the media, who were very, very public, and at the same time, very, as you said, very confident. Let me tell you one very quick story. Mel Brooks was about 25, 26. He was working for Sid Caesar, the great TV comic that had a show on national television, your show of shows. And he was a sketch writer. So he was walking on across 57th Street near Carnegie Hall. And on his left was Larry Gelbart, another sketch writer, who later created the version of MASH for television. On his right was Neil Simon, who later became Neil Simon. They were unknown. At this point, they were sketch writers, and three nuns were approaching them across 57th Street. And Gelbart said, "No, Mel, no." And what? What are you talking about? And Neil Simon said, "Will you get hold of yourself?" "Nothing. What's the matter with you?" The nuns come right up in front of them, and Mel leaps out at them and says, "Take off those costumes. The nun's sketch is out." Well, I said, "How did they react?" He said, "They hit the ground."
They
Now,
didn't get out of their uniforms.
well, he did that to them in another
That would have
movie.
been pretty funny if they had actually been in uniform.
Yes. Leonard Bernstein taught the Vienna Philharmonic how to play its own music, namely Gustav Mahler's later symphonies.
Who also, of course, had a very complicated relationship with his own Jewishness or lack of Jewishness, Mahler.
Oh, he was very Jewish. I don't know if he was actually observant. I don't think so, but he wrote a Kaddish symphony. He wrote a kind of.
Who Bernstein rather than Mahler, of course.
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, Mahler had to become a Christian in order to get the state opera conductorship. It was a state situation, but he was Jewish through and through.
And his music was certainly rather Jewish.
Yes, full of the sound of the shofar being blown and the klezmer musicians, but turned into complex ironies and self-mockery. Yeah, it was very Jewish music. Anyway, Bernstein taught the Vienna Philharmonic how to play their own music, and I could go on, but I don't mean to imply that Jewish virtue consists of telling off Gentiles. Certainly not. But my point is, they were not afraid of being punished. They didn't think they were going to be punished.
Well, I'm sure Mel Brooks wanted to be punished. That was one of his
yeah,
things, right?
But he wanted to make an uproar. He wanted to, assault his loathing of death by asserting the body in every way possible.
I have to ask David the Philip Roth question. I'm sure you've had to deal with it 100 times, but most people associate 20th century America with Philip Roth. Did you choose not to have him because he was born too late in 1933? Is there a big difference between being born in 33 versus 23 when Mailer was born? They kind of
Well,
look alike as well.
yes, I thought that's the next generation, maybe another book, the ones who were born in the next decade. And a lot of it has been written about Roth recently, and his own work is so autobiographical in many cases. So I put him aside. Um, Although it's something was going on in the late 60s that affected Jews who came out of rather restrained second generation backgrounds, people who were distrustful of heavy drinkers, and they tended to go to bed sober. My parents were like this.
Tell us a
So
little bit. You mentioned that before we went live, David. Tell me a little bit about your background. Your family's name wasn't always Denby, was it?
no, it was Denbosky, and there were Lithuanian Jews. Although on my mother's side, there was a pastry chef from Vienna who was brought over by Oscar of the Waldorf. So it's a kind of mixed um, European background. And in 1929, when the market crashed for the first time, apart from what we're going through now, uh, my father and his brother, who was a broker, went to the court and got their names changed to Denby, which I think was actually the name of a dripless teapot in
Mm.
England. You cannot get more responsible, respectful than Denby, apparently. And people have always asked me, thinking I was a wasp. So there was the change.
It wouldn't be out of place, Denby and Eminent Victorians, of course, the Lytton
Yeah,
Straight book, which I'm assuming you're playing with in terms of calling the book Eminent Jews.
well, Lytton Strachey was a member of the Bloomsbury Circle. He was a friend of Virginia Woolf, and he was a literary intellectual historian. And he picked four representative figures from Victorian England, not Gladstone and Disraeli and Darwin, but Cardinal Manning, and people who represented Thomas Arnold. People who represented the spirit of the age, and his point was very, very critical. I mean, it's a wicked book. It's about hypocrisy, and Bertrand Russell was reading it when he was imprisoned as a conscientious objector during the First World War, and was laughing out loud. And the prison guard came over and said, "You're not supposed to have such a good time in a British prison." So that was Lytton Strachey. Now, so I picked up the idea of the four representative rather than the most famous people of the
So
era.
what? I mean, these people are very. I mean, you couldn't have more extreme opposites, I'm guessing, in terms of personality than Betty Friedan and Mel Brooks. I mean, the most extreme. What
Right.
unites Mel Brooks and Betty Friedan?
That might have gone well. Betty really liked men. The most famous feminist in the country who wrote The Feminine Mystique. It was women she had trouble with. I've always thought
Didn't
I
have
could.
much of a sense of humor, Betty Friedan, though, did she?
I would say somewhere around zero. Um, She was a plain girl from Peoria, Illinois, about 100 miles southwest of Chicago. It was an anti-Semitic town. She didn't get into the school sorority, and you could say, so what? But it mattered a great deal to her. She went to Smith, and she was a great student, and eventually wound up in New York, not knowing what she wanted to write. And she wrote for the women's magazines, and they kept changing her copy. So when she wrote about a woman who was both a homemaker and some sort of big professional, they would just change it into a happy homemaker article, and which enraged her. And by degrees, she got to her passion, which was to talk to middle class, white, suburban women. This is both the strength and the weakness of the book. And just using reporters' methods. She didn't have big data. She wasn't a sociologist. And she read everything, and all kinds of so-called experts on the nature of women and how they were passive and so on, and were afraid of being aggressive, and were meant biologically to be only mothers and wives, all of that. And she brought out this tremendous book in 1963. And it did well. It sold about 60,000 copies, but she was furious that the publisher didn't push it much harder. So then it went into mass market paperback, and it sold 1,300,000 copies.
Well, I mean, Friedan was, of course, writing for all women. Bernstein was making music for everybody. Mailer, I guess, was writing for everyone. I'm not so sure about Mel Brooks, what he was doing in terms of the goal of the kind of audience he wanted. Were these people, in terms of trying to join the dots, were they writing or making movies or making music for Jews, or did it somehow manifest a certain kind of Jewishness, their creativity?
I think that's a very good question. I think both things are true. Mel definitely. Um, he couldn't stop talking about being Jewish. I mean, the word Jew popped out of him like candy from a gumball machine, and he played with it. He was on Johnny Carson about 1980, and he said, this is a big fraud. I was born 5'11", blonde hair, perfect straight nose, and I went into the hospital and they knocked the stuffings out of me. They took 2 inches off my legs, and they altered my nose and brought my voice down a couple of octaves because I wanted to be a Jew comic. And notice he didn't say a Jewish comic. Jewish, it's a quirk of the language. Jewish is fairly anodyne. It's just a description. Jew still has the power of a brand. It's still.
Although Brooks, in his own way, I mean, The Producers is a magnificent. I mean, you're the movie guy, David, but The Producers is one of the, in my mind, one of the best sort of satires of maybe even political correctness, but certainly what the Jews went through in the 20th century. So he had a degree of seriousness in him, in spite of all the humor, or maybe along with the humor.
I take him more seriously than other people with that. I hope killing the fun, and he was. I can say unequivocally he was obsessed with death. His father died when he was 2. He never knew his father, and many of the jokes are about accidents and death. And then, as you say, you get to The Producers, and it's a hilarious comic number, Springtime for Hitler, which people now, love it so much they just sing it to each other at dinner parties, but caused a great shock in 1967. To hear boys and girls in Nazi uniforms and regalia. It's partly a joke on the cliches of Broadway musical numbers, but I think it's directed towards the Jews in part because, the Broadway musical until the 70s was almost, except for Cole Porter, of course, was almost entirely Jewish. And the audience for musicals, certainly early in the run, in New York run of a new musical, was heavily Jewish. I think he was saying, wait, let me just finish. I think he was saying, you can laugh at this now. This was the most horrible thing ever, but you're alive, and I can revive Hitler only to make fun of him. And you can begin to get over. Now, I don't know if he would say that now after October 7th. I don't want to put words in his mouth. But even more extraordinary was from History of the World Part 1, not from 1981, a movie, I'm sorry to say, I panned in New York Magazine, was another musical number called The Inquisition, in which Mel is Torquemada, the Grand Inquisitor, and a red cassock, and they're singing and dancing monks, and the Jews are strung up on the walls in all sorts of grotesque and humiliating ways. So, I mean, I kept asking him about it.
People, it's good entertainment for Passover and Easter to watch.
Exactly right. I was shocked, deeply shocked by it. Many people.
I'm thinking out loud here, David. So, and I know you're not shy, so please correct me if I'm wrong in a way. Do you think that Mel Brooks is, sort of overt, absurd humor was a form of self-defense? The more absurd you could become, the less you could be actually criticized, and it's a good way of wrapping yourself, almost a Groucho Marx style humor as a way of defense.
Well, yes, exactly. You tried to kill us all. We're here, and we hate death, and we're going to make you hate death, and we're going to assert ourselves as Jews. But I think it goes past defensiveness in his case. When he was a young man, he was the noisiest man in New York, which takes some talent. when in his
How
20s.
does he? I mean, when you're good on dates? When was Groucho Marx born, and how does he connect
Well,
with that kind
they're
of
the
music?
earlier generation, of course, and they were in both in on Broadway and in vaudeville and Broadway, and then in those extraordinary movies. And there's bits of Yiddish that they throw in there. I mean, I think people who are fairly knowing knew that these were for Jewish comics.
Well, it's not hard to know.
Yes, exactly.
I mean,
Uh,
even if you're not Jewish. And then comparing Brooks with Bernstein, for all his musical genius, there was an element of absurdity about Bernstein. He was, of course, satirized by Tom Wolfe in Bernstein's support for the Black Panthers and his what some people see as rather absurd sympathy with the more radical movements of the late 60s. Is there a difference between someone like Bernstein, who appears much more Anglo, certainly, than Brooks or even Norman Mailer? Was he more confident, more willing to make a fool of himself?
well, first of all, his conducting style was very physical, which caused a lot of upset. In part, critics of German Jewish background, like Harold Schoenberg in New York, were dismayed by his full-bodied style of conducting. When he went to Vienna the first time in 1966, they loved it. And when he came back, the New York critics said, "Oh, he's attained a new maturity." The Viennese, the center of classical music, loved the expressive fluency that had repelled the New York critics. So, I mean, and I think if you look at it now, it doesn't seem anything excessive about it. It's all very detailed about subdividing the beat and cueing in solos and everything. The prigs who were complaining about that tended to go away after a while. So he was very openly Jewish. He went to Israel repeatedly. He was there during the War of Liberation in 1948, running around with an orchestra not very far from where the battles were actually happening. He wrote a Kaddish symphony in which a speaker like Job addresses God, and he kept. I would say he was obsessed with a God that he didn't think existed, if I can put it that way. He was angry at God for not being present.
Is
Uh,
there a little bit of Leonard Cohen in him, or a bit of Bernstein in Leonard Cohen? Do you
oh,
think?
I think so. And so, as were saying, there was a part of him that was an outspoken liberal and should have kept his mouth shut, about world peace. He thought music could solve everything. As if Beethoven's Ninth, with its message of universal brotherhood, were playing in his head all the time.
And what about his sexuality? We talked before we went live about the biopic of Bernstein, and I think it was from last year or the year before, which you enjoyed. I thought was quite good. It certainly focused in part on his sexuality. He seems more willing to take risks in his life, perhaps his private life, certainly than Betty Friedan or Mel Brooks.
Um, he was gay, but also he was bisexual. He had a lot of girlfriends when he was in college and afterwards up at Tanglewood in Massachusetts as a music student. But he truly adored Felicia Montelegre. There's no doubt about that, and I've spoken to the children, and they were absolutely sure of it. But he couldn't deny that other part of him, and at times. It was very painful for her, and uh, he sort of embarrassed her and angered her, and she put up with it. At a certain point, he left her.
And this was his wife. This was featured in the bio. What was the name of the film, Dave?
Maestro, and you get a good sense of what she was like. She was a good actress and a career of her own, which she sort of gave up for him.
And actually, as it happens, I don't know how you did it, but your book, Eminent Jews, comes with a lovely blurb from Bradley Cooper, who was who acted as Leonard Bernstein in the movie. Did you know? Do you know Cooper? Did you give him
No,
some
I didn't know him at all, and I didn't review the movie. I was gone as a movie critic. I just wrote him a note and sent him the book, thinking perhaps he would like it.
Nice.
So,
So
but
yeah, I mean these are the bookends, I would guess, Bernstein and Friedan, in terms of their glamour and seriousness and the complexity of their private lives. What about Norman Mailer?
well,
History hasn't been. Would it be fair to say, David, that history hasn't been particularly kind to him, in contrast, perhaps, with Roth?
well, he had many women who loved his writing. Most significantly, Joan Didion, who wrote about him, and Lillian Hellman and Diana Trilling, who was a sort of haughty New York intellectual, was fascinated by him. At this point, almost women shudder at the sound of his name, and he, the horror was he assaulted his second wife, Adele Morales, and I go into this a great deal. What led up to it intellectually, the kind of ideological notion, the glorification of violence, and so on, and the personal problems that the two of them had. It was a passionate, dangerous marriage from the beginning. But the extraordinary thing is that afterwards, and he said, "I let down God." He said to his daughter, and I did a cowardly, shameful thing. He said in court. He underwent observation at Bellevue Hospital for 17 days, and when he came home, she had been patched up, and she was there with their two little girls, and she wanted to continue the marriage and was obsessed with him for the rest of her life. She lived till 90 and wrote a book about the whole thing, including the terrible things she said to him when he came in the course of this drunken party that led to his act.
Yeah, at least he. I mean, he believed that God existed. In contrast to Bernstein, he was, of course, one of the pioneers of creative nonfiction, new journalism, along with people like Truman Capote, Hunter Thompson. You mentioned Joan Didion and Tom Wolfe. What was Jewish then? What was distinctively Jewish about Mailer?
He was running away from it and running toward it at the same time, and
which is a very Jewish thing, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, he was upset by being. He said the one image of myself that's insupportable is that of a nice Jewish boy from Brooklyn, which is what he was. He was the neighborhood darling, and made beautiful toy airplanes. But when he was 14, 15. He would go to the Jersey coast where his aunt had a big hotel, and she would give him a room, and he would write fiction. He was absolutely a dedicated, obsessive writer from the middle of his teenage years. And in so many other ways, I mean, he was reacting against the kind of sexually reticent, cautious behavior of the previous generation of Jews. They hated people who drank heavily. My parents were very contemptuous of what they called shickers because they were not good family men. Mailer drank heavily. They loved Miami. He hated Miami. They hated violence because it would be turned against them. He was fascinated with boxers and spies.
Could we have got to Philip Roth without Mailer? Is it necessary to have a Mailer to get a Roth?
That's a very good question, and I don't think Roth said much. I mean, Roth was annoyed with him because he had in some of his stories, Mailer's stories, he had obviously Jewish characters with waspy names. So I mean, it's like he said, Mailer's afraid of showing Jewish men as lustful and uninhibited, and which of course was what Roth did in Portnoy. But there's a cultural moment here. In the late 60s, Mel does the producers with Springtime for Hitler. Mailer writes this fantastic book called Armies of the Night, which was about an anti-war protest in Washington, the book about the 60s. And he records the night before the march, he got drunk and peed on the floor of a movie theater before giving a big speech.
Oh, dear.
And the third one, of course, is Philip Roth and Portnoy's Complaint, which was coming out in pieces in 67 and 68, all at the same time. And they were, pushing away from the previous generation of Jewish restraint. They were discovering the
Right.
Jewish
And
pride.
Mailer wasn't, of course, the first prominent 20th century American Jewish writer. How does he connect with somebody like Saul Bellow, who's seen as sort of the
He,
father of Jewish
he
literature in many ways?
doesn't really. I mean, they were going at the same time, and he reviewed some of. He wrote these enormously aggressive, funny surveys of the literary scene, and he was not crazy about Bellow, and I can imagine Bellow's attitude towards him was disdainful because Mailer was so much a publicity seeker and was always on television and was always misbehaving and getting his picture in the paper and so on. And Bellow was much more
Yeah.
austere literary man.
So speaking in the 2025, David, who was aged best? I mean, Bernstein has, so to speak, entered the canon. Friedan is the founder of the first wave of American feminism, which is
Second
now,
wave.
oh, so
Second
sorry,
wave.
second wave, which
Yes.
is now a lot of third wave or post-feminist American thinkers are critical of her. Mel Brooks is, of course, I mean, as we say, his movie, The Producers in particular, Blazing Saddles, is still considered classics. Do you think it would be fair to say that Mailer has aged the worst?
Well, I think he needs to be rediscovered. I think he's a very great writer. He wrote the best World War II novel.
Which is what? Which the best?
The Naked and the Dead.
Right.
He wrote it when he was 25, and it was an enormous bestseller, and it terrified him that he could no longer observe people because now he was famous, and he had no idea what to do next, and he stalled for quite a while. He wrote what I mentioned before, Armies of the Night, which is the book about the 60s, and he saw the clash in 1967 between educated white liberal kids and rural and small town whites who hated everything that they still, what we've got now. In other words, that split. It's all there in Armies of the Night. And there's a fantastic book about Gary Gilmore. Gary Gilmore was a lifetime convict. He came out. Finally, after years, he had killed senselessly 2 people, murders that didn't make any sense to anyone. And he demanded to be executed by firing squad. The whole liberal lawyer establishment tried to save him. No, he demanded to be executed. Mailer wasn't involved in this till afterwards. He then spent 8 months in South Central Utah, which is Gary and his family. So I'm interviewing everybody, and then when he wrote it up, he took his own voice out altogether. There is, I mean, in Armies of the Night, there's a character called Mailer, and in his about going to the moon, there was a character called Aquarius. There's a way he was able to animate himself as a figure in his own writing, but he took himself out altogether. It's 1,000 pages, and you can't put it down. It completely recreates, this is the Executioner's Song, completely recreates South Central Utah, a part of the country that, is as far from him as could possibly be. And I think that's a classic. So I think these things, some of them are in Library of America, which is our sort of semi-official classics collection of books. And I think people will slowly come back to him. At the moment, it's very hard to get women.
Yeah, it's a good reminder. I need to read.
Yeah.
I have to admit, I haven't read all his stuff. One of the reviews of the book, one of the early reviews, David suggested in Forward, a Jewish newspaper, suggested that the golden age, this is how they led with the review, the golden age for American Jews is over, and wow, was it short. Was it, in your view, this period you write about, was it a golden age, and is it over?
I think it was a golden age for all the reasons we've been saying before, and I don't think it's over. I mean, it's all right. So you can say there are fewer Jews going to Harvard and Princeton than there were 30 years ago. So what? I mean, there's still, we are 2.3% of the population, about 7 million. And worldwide, by the way, there are 18 million Jews worldwide among 8 billion people. And among other things, I have no restricted notions of identity. If you can be Jewish by heritage, by adoption, by declaration, there aren't enough of us to make exclusive definitions. But I don't. The level of accomplishment in relation to the small size of the number is still extraordinary. If you want to be literal about it, the Jews are no longer top dog in earnings. Ethnically, it is Asian Americans, but they're Asians from all over the place. I mean, it's very hard to generalize. They're from Japan and China and Indonesia and Vietnam, and like that. But I think the threat to Jews at the moment is yes, there's anti-Semitism on campus. Perhaps not as much as some people are saying. The Trump administration is doing something very cynical. What they really want to do is to crush the universities, to crush any area of independent thought, and they're using the anti-Semitism that occasionally happens at Columbia and other places as a reason to cut off the flow of money. That money goes for basic research, and most of it is in science and medicine, but it also spills over into the humanities. They're trying to bring American civilization to its knees. I am not given to overstatement. That is the truth, and the problem is that the Jews are the pretext for it, and they're being set up as the heavies.
Yeah, a lot of people have written about that. So, without wishing to distinguish American Jews from other Americans, this book, Eminent Jews, and your focus on the mid 20th century experience of American Jews, what can that teach all Americans about the promise, the idea of America, of what some people call the American dream? Are all these four characters in your book, are they all manifestations one way or the other of a kind of American dream?
Well, yes, I think they are, but it melds, and here's where you have to be cautious about generalizations, with certain demands of Jewish character that come out of their history. I mean, Jews were the subject of a terrible double bind. They were God's chosen people, and they were defenseless, right? They get to America, and of course Israel, and in America they're no longer defenseless, but there is an overlay of wariness, a determination to succeed. And since America offered them freedom of conscience, George Washington wrote this extraordinary letter to the congregation in Newport after he became president, saying everyone should feel free to be under his fig tree and assert himself as for what he is. I mean, and there's plenty of anti-Semitism, of course, and it ebbs and flows, but there's Jewish character insisted. Jews don't really believe in the afterlife. There's nothing about the afterlife in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible. What you have to do is not be a mediocrity in this earth, on this life. There's a Hasidic tale, a certain Rabbi Zusia, and he's dying. And he says, when I get to heaven, this guy did believe in the afterlife. He said, when I get to heaven, they're not going to say to me, why weren't you Mozart? Why weren't you Moses? Sorry. Why weren't you Moses? They're going to say to me, why weren't you Zusia? Think about that for a bit. What it means is, why weren't you a better version of yourself? That is that desire to be the best version of yourself that you can be. There's no state of grace for Jews. It's a hard religion. You can't confess. You can't know that you're enjoying God's grace. You may offer your soul on Yom Kippur to God. That doesn't mean He's heard you. It's more a state of yearning than of grace. And there's this whole high prestige for arguing. There's, Abraham has this extraordinary conversation with God right there in Genesis. So, you're going to really kill all of the Sodomites. What if there are 30 good men? That conversation. Jacob wrestles with the angel. You must bless me or I won't let you go. Job has his horrible complaints and talks to God. He doesn't assail him, but he certainly questions him. There's there's an emphasis on questioning and arguing. Maybe that's why there's so
Right,
much
and I think your
lawyer
point, this is perhaps what ties all your eminent Jews together, is that they all
arguing.
became who they were. Leonard Bernstein, Mel Brooks, Betty Friedan, Norman Mailer. They realized, I mean, they pushed themselves or to the limit, for better or worse.
Right. I mean, you have to have great talent to do that, or not anyone. If someone is just pushy and untalented, that's of no use whatsoever. So, I mean, it has to be allied to understanding and talent. Lenny had a peculiar problem. That's in Maestro. Lenny was good at 6 things. Most of us are good at 1 or 2. I can make a decent 3-egg omelet, and I can write a little. That's it. He could do 6 things.
Yeah, although I think one of the things about Maestro that suggested is that he was cursed by being able, he never did anything. I mean, my reading of Maestro, and I don't want, is that he never, perhaps he might have been better off if he could only have done one thing.
I don't think so. I mean, people have been saying that forever. And there was a lot of the criticism after he became music director of the New York Philharmonic in 1958. Oh, why don't you give up Broadway? Or why don't you give up conducting and just devote yourself? Because West Side Story was an incredible show. And he could have done those things, and I think I would reverse that whole critique and say he could express himself the best in each individual thing by doing all of them. That he had that kind of nature. Now it caused him a lot of suffering. Also, in his own opinion, the classical pieces were never what he wasn't Stravinsky. He wasn't Shostakovich. Well, neither was anyone else. But a lot of those pieces have been exhumed, and people are listening to them now with fresh appreciation. And he's being programmed all over the world. The classical pieces, the
Yeah, it'd
shows.
be interesting to see how he gets compared to, I don't know, Philip Glass or
Yeah,
or
he was reacting.
Steve Reich. Finally, it's
Yeah,
such an
go ahead.
interesting subject, David. The book just got reviewed in the Wall Street Journal by Joseph Epstein, their kind of resident Jewish reviewer, I think. The title comes about pushing the boundaries. He liked the book, but he suggests that you didn't choose better Jews. He's not a big fan of Bernstein's politics or Betty Friedan's lack of humor. But is there such a thing as a better Jew? Is that the point of
No,
the
the
book?
point was that they were what they were, and they were extraordinary versions of themselves. And if Betty Friedan had had more humor, she might not have written the Feminine Mystique.
She might have appeared on the Catskills with Mel Brooks.
We don't need. Well, that is a thought, Betty Friedan in the Catskills. No, she was truculent. She was aggrieved. She thought she should, run all the meetings of the National Organization for Women. If someone else was talking, she would speak over it in a stage whisper that could be heard in New Jersey. She could be unpleasant, but I think she's a genuine heroine, and that book is still very much worth reading. And she wrote a ton of other stuff. Bernstein was what he was. He needed to do all these things to feel fully alive, and that's both his glory and his tragedy. I think a lot of his. I think he's over the top. I think Mel is over the top. Mailer, as we were saying before, needs to be rediscovered. He wrote 3 or 4 American classics that I think are equal to Walt Whitman's poetry. They are that rich. Descriptively, he was always interested in the soul of the country, what the underground, the lava flow underneath the ordinary reality of business and politics. And he got that. And that will become more and more interesting in a few years.
Well, David Denby, real honor to talk to you. I've always been a fan of your work. I loved your book, American Sucker and Snark. This is more personal, more serious, an important new book. It's out. Everyone, especially, well, not just Jews, we don't want to single them out, but I think a lot of people will find this book fascinating. Some people will want other people in the book, but it's exactly the kind of book which we need. Eminent Jews, Bernstein, Brooks, Friedan, Mailer. I'm going to reread, or actually I'm going to start reading Mailer on your advice. Congratulations, David, on the new book, and love to get you back on the show to talk movies, because you know this stuff inside out. I'd be interested.
Nora.
Yeah, Nora's good, isn't it?
Oh, I never had such a good time in my life.
Okay, well, we'll do a show in the next few weeks on Honora. You'll do that, yeah?
I'd love to talk about Honora. I have to tell you, I'm no longer a movie critic, so I can't really.
Well, once a movie critic, always a movie critic, right?
Thank you very much. You're a hell of an interviewer, and this was challenging and fun.
Well, I'm sure you tell all the girls that, David, like
yes,
Norman Mailer. Okay, David, we'll get you back on to talk Honora. Thank you so much.